It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Dr. Evan Hepler Smith, who's going to be talking to you about compound words, synthetic world, chemists, computing, and the environment. He is currently at Boston College as a core visiting assistant professor of history and science and technology studies. He's published in venues ranging from environmental history, a piece coming out, it's already up online, it's coming out, to ISIS, a leading journal in history science. From there all the way to Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal. And so, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and I look forward to the talk. Thanks for coming to do this.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate having the chance to present my work to you here, and thanks Sam and Mark for helping to put this together as well. Right. So in 1839, the German chemist Friedrich Wöhler wrote to his Swedish mentor Jacob Berzelius that organic chemistry can drive a person totally crazy these days. It's like a tropical jungle full of the strangest things, an enormous thicket without beginning or end that you don't dare enter. Nowadays, it's not just organic chemists like Wöhler and Berzelius, but all of us really who are in this thicket. Right? If you think about the synthetic materials that have gone into the carpets and the chairs and this podium, the sealants and the solvents and the stain-proofing and grease-proofing materials, the drugs in our bodies, the personal care products we've all probably used today. We live in a synthetic world. Synthesis, molecule making, is the central method of the diverse chemical sciences, the central activity of the $5 trillion a year global chemicals industry, and a central concern for the health of humans and ecosystems around the world. Some people try to beat back the synthetic world, plastic by plastic, pesticide by pesticide, but others insist that the distinction between natural and synthetic is itself just a fallacy. Chemophobia, scaremongering, as is satirized in this website, warning consumers about the dangers of DHMO, that is dihydrogen monoxide, that is H2O, that is water. So in this view, whatever you call something and wherever it came from, a molecule is a molecule. And just as we know that concrete human-scale materials have politics, the politics of oil in the Middle East, or shale gas in Pennsylvania, or hybrid wheat in South Asia, the conviction that a molecule is a molecule, this idea, has a politics too. So we also live in a world of computing, a digital world. Information and communications technologies have transformed or sometimes reproduced and entrenched ways of life, labor, economic opportunity, intimate bonds, and imagined communities. Supposedly objective technologies of surveillance and judgment transform, or again sometimes reproduce, relations between people, corporations, and states. Whose email gets read, who gets a loan, who gets parole. Now the synthetic world and the digital world meet in projects like this. The application of machine learning and big data to the discovery of new drugs. This is path-breaking work, or maybe not. Because as it turns out, the histories of molecular science and technology and computer-based science and technology have been entangled for a long time. Synthetic chemistry has been shaped by computing and information technologies. Conversely, things like automated translation and artificial intelligence have been shaped by efforts to solve problems about chemicals. The histories of molecular science and technology and computer-based science and technology are inextricably intertwined. In my book in progress, Compound Words, Chemists' Information and the Synthetic World, I trace this twinned history of molecules and computers back to the origin of the synthetic chemicals industry in the late 19th century. I argue that the material and institutional order of 20th century global chemistry came into being through chemists' ongoing efforts to compile and exploit chemical information. I also argue that the very same efforts to make the most of chemical information gave 20th century computing some of its key methods and projects. Now, it goes without saying that the histories of chemistry and computing are very big, very diverse. And studying the global history of modern science and technology means decentering linear narratives of diffusion and instead reckoning with multiplicity, right? Many computings, many chemistries. But it also means appreciating where the universalizing assumptions about technoscience that structure those linear narratives come from, and what all is built on top of them. And that's, I think, what we get by exploring the long-term entanglements of chemistry and computing. A contingent story of how and by whom specific chemical categories and computational methods have been enacted as putatively universal through the making of infrastructural information technologies. My talk today is in 3 parts. The first 2 parts are drawn from my book, the third from that article just out in Environmental History. Part 1 addresses chemists, primarily in 19th century Europe. Part 2 layers in books and computers, primarily in the US in the early to mid 20th century, a period when a computer could be a person, most often a woman, as well as a machine. Part 3 follows these molecules and computers into the history of toxic chemicals regulation at the US EPA. Throughout the talk, we're going to have a little help from a molecule called PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. For a long time, it was the crucial ingredient in Teflon production, but it's recently been phased out in the US. And it's poised, actually just in a couple of weeks from now, to be officially designated by the United Nations as an especially harmful persistent organic pollutant, like DDT or dioxin. Now, what's more, environmental toxicologists worry that PFOA is just kind of the tip of a chemical iceberg, one among many thousands of related molecules that collectively pose an intractable, potentially never-ending chemicals management issue. So I'm not going to say too much during my talk about these specific hazards and who they affect and how they came to light. We can definitely talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. Rather, what I want to do is show you how my history of chemists and computers is behind this frustratingly intractable problem, as well as some of the taken-for-granted achievements of environmental chemicals regulation. A quick word on terminology. The meaning of this word molecule can be pretty slippery, which is part of my story. But I'm going to touch on some discussions that specifically address these molecular diagrams called structural formulas. When I refer to molecular structure, I'm talking about one of these. On a Monday in April in 1892, 34 of the foremost chemists in Europe gathered in Geneva. They came together to address something they saw as an urgent threat to the future of chemistry: confusing nomenclature. Specifically, the confusing nomenclature of organic chemicals, that is, chemicals containing the element carbon. This was one of a spate of scientific and cultural congresses in late 19th century Europe, and like many other such enterprises, then and since, the Geneva Congress was simultaneously a cosmopolitan, international, national, and local event. Its participants pursued agendas at all of these levels. For instance, Charles Friedel, the organizer of the Congress, hoped that reforming the international language of chemistry would enable his faction of Alsatian chemists within Parisian academic politics to import German-style chemistry to aid France in the rivalry with Germany that had left Friedel a foreigner in his hometown of Strasbourg since the War of 1870. The gathering also came at a particular point in the history of chemistry. Traditions of isolating plant and animal substances and making them into useful products date back to antiquity and span the world. But the field that we call organic chemistry emerged in early to mid-19th century Europe, when chemists began to speculate that the myriad plant and animal-derived substances they were working with, things like quinine and alcohol and oils and waxes, were all connected by some sort of underlying material order that had something to do with the preponderance of this element carbon that they all contained. There were a befuddling diversity of theories for how this worked. For example, here are 19 different formulas, each purporting to describe the internal atomic structure of one compound, acetic acid, that is, vinegar. This was that tropical jungle that Fuller was talking about. Steadily, though, experimenting with coal tar, the sludgy, toxic, carbon-rich waste product of the gas works that illuminated 19th century cities, researchers worked their way toward more consistent notions about atoms, bonds, and molecules, a set of ideas that became known as structure theory. They expressed these ideas using diagrams called structural formulas. This was a shared visual language that proved really useful for describing patterns of chemical relationships. So, for example, chemists had,
It's too much of a synthetic world.
It might just be a connection.
I know.
You need to turn it off and turn it on.
Yeah, it looks like it turned itself off.
Yeah, it seems like a power switch.
The wall connection sometimes?
This is the projector still?
Yeah, where is
The
oh, it's
projector.
down there.
Projectors.
It looks like the display just decided to cool itself down. I can keep going through until we reboot. So imagine you're looking at these assemblages of balls and sticks. Chemists have these kind of two substances they're working with, same composition, right? Isopropyl alcohol and propyl alcohol. C3H8O, made of the same stuff, except when you react them with oxygen, in one case with isopropyl alcohol, you get acetone, familiar compound with well-known properties. In the other case, propyl alcohol, you get propionic acid, an acid very much like vinegar, acetic acid. What these structural formulas, these diagrams of balls and sticks representing chemical substances did, was allow chemists to synthesize lots of observations like this about different patterns, different observable patterns in which chemical substances reacted in a way that allowed them to make sense not only of this set of different ways of reacting with a substance, oxygen, but a whole other series of patterns of observable chemical interactions. Now, the point I want to make here is that chemists did not intend these formulas to be interpreted as realistic depictions of what they thought was actually going on in the world at the nano level. They instead found them really, really useful heuristic kind of bookkeeping devices. We'll come back to this. So, working in this way, along these lines, in university laboratories, as well as in industrial enterprises, especially in the lands that became the nation of Germany at just about this time, chemists synthesized lots and lots of novel organic chemicals. Some of these became culture-making, society-shaping products. Synthetic drugs, like aspirin and heroin. Synthetic dyes, such as these brilliant azo colors, which not only transformed fashion, but also biomedicine, as stains that made tissue sections and bacteria visible under the microscope. Chemists also synthesized synthetic copies of natural substances, such as the synthetic indigo of the German firm BASF, whose mass production in the late 19th century devastated the indigo-based colonial plantation economy in British India, and brought about an alliance of German chemical firms with Indian nationalists advocating reindustrialization. Structural formulas catalyzed this flood of synthetic chemicals. But when it came to organizing information, chemists' publications about all these chemicals, structural formulas weren't going to do the job. They were costly to typeset, they were difficult to put into any kind of obvious order, and so instead, journal indexes relied on chemical names. But chemical names were a total morass of homonyms and synonyms. For example, in this 1880 index, we've got chlornitrobenzol and nitrochlorobenzol and monochloronitrobenzol and mononitrochlorobenzol. 4 names, 4 different pages, same substance, no cross-references. This impeded the ability of chemists to extend and exploit each other's work. And the situation was worst in the areas of most intense research interest. Take, for example, these nitrogen-containing rings. These are analogs of plant-derived alkaloids like quinine and morphine. If nomenclature were put in order, right, if you could get beyond having 5 different names for one substance, or sometimes having the same name for 2 different substances, chemists thought, maybe evidence from all these different studies could be brought together, maybe yielding a blockbuster drug, say a synthetic variant on quinine that could more effectively treat the malaria epidemic that emerged as mosquitoes bred in those abandoned indigo fields. So, parenthetically, history of chemistry, I think, opens up these kinds of opportunities for telling connected global histories, following chains of causes and consequences across different material, economic, geographic, and cultural registers. So, that is what brought these 32 chemists to Geneva in 1892. By day, they debated nomenclature. By night, they attended the opera, toasted each other over a banquet, adjourned to a local tavern, and consumed a generous supply of champagne. And through all of this chemical bonding, through all this sociable interaction, the Congress managed to come to a unanimous agreement on 62 rules of nomenclature for assigning every chemical compound a unique official name for use in indexes and reference works. So no more hopping around to find all those nitrochlors and chloronitrous. One name for one chemical. These rules had far-reaching consequences in science, technology, medicine, and patent law. But I want to point out just 3 important features. First, these rules established a strict correspondence between a chemical name and the structural formula, molecular structure. The rules were a kind of algorithm for dividing up a structural formula into pieces and translating that into prefixes, suffixes, and roots. And then conversely for translating these compound words back into structural formulas. Second, in doing so, these official names tended to kind of marginalize many features that are generally desirable in nomenclature, like consistency with existing names, or legibility, or pronounceability. And third, as one astute observer remarked, these were really names of formulas rather than names of substances. As I mentioned, right, those structural formulas were kind of useful heuristic bookkeeping devices. One structural formula didn't always correspond to one empirical laboratory chemical substance. There were plenty of chemical substances whose structural formula remained uncertain. And you could even draw structural formulas and thus write names for chemicals nobody had ever found or made. For example, PFOA, which wouldn't be first synthesized until the 1940s, nevertheless had a Geneva name, 2,2,3,3,4,4,5,5,6,6,7,7,8,8,8 pentadecafluorooctanoic acid. So this idea that the Geneva Rules established about how chemical naming ought to work was that it established a precise, rule-bound correspondence between chemicals as material substances and molecular structures as diagrams and systematic names as identities. I call this the systematic ideal. I want to emphasize again that this melding of substance and diagram and name, so that systematic ideal, was not a way for chemists to express what they thought the chemicals they studied or made or sold actually were. It was rather intended to enable them to find information about the many thousands of chemicals they weren't studying, never thought of making, or might conceivably want to sell. Chemists around the world adopted and adapted this set of nomenclature rules, the Geneva nomenclature, as a kind of stepping stone to industrial modernity. Many, however, while they loved this idea, hated the execution. And this launched a debate, which really continues through the present day, over how chemicals should be named that quickly became entangled with other sorts of concerns. For instance, take the French chemist, Nobel laureate Victor Grignard. He was a strong supporter of France's post-World War I efforts to claim reparations from Germany by force, and he was willing to fight, at least verbally, any Anglo-American chemist who suggested otherwise. And so here, Grignard, in keeping with these politics, was calling for a linguistic solidarity against the benighted Germans and British and Americans. And here is an exhortation by Charles Leroux, who had been head of French chemical warfare research during World War I. This is from a speech just after the war's end, in which Leroux urged his fellow chemists to ready themselves for the coming scientific and industrial battle. This was a battle in which, among all the instruments the chemist uses, there is nothing more indispensable than good books and good bibliographic literature. The chemist can no more do without these than without the balance or the thermometer. So debates over how to name chemicals became debates over who would control chemical information, and perhaps even chemistry itself. A contest in which, as Moreau argued, reference literature was the key. There's been a murder in the chemistry library. A vial of cyanide has gone missing. The detective, our narrator, and a chemistry professor examine a book. It said, Beilstein. I opened to the page, and just to give you an idea, the first words were 4'-chlor, 4-brom-2-nitrodiphenyl ether. The professor said in a cool voice, this is a volume of Beilstein, Beilstein's Handbook of Organic Chemistry. This book is only one of more than 60 volumes. For all research men in organic chemistry, these volumes are an absolute necessity. The chemistry librarian had an alibi, but it turns out, spoiler alert, her alibi unraveled because it would have meant she didn't recognize the name Beilstein. And as the professor explains in the denouement, to a chemistry librarian, the name Beilstein was more familiar than Christopher Columbus, George Washington, or Mother Goose. Thus concludes the 1956 story, What's in a Name, by Isaac Asimov. Best known as a science fiction author, Asimov was also a chemistry professor. And so he was familiar with the vital importance of reference literature for research in organic chemistry, especially Beilstein and the American publication Chemical Abstracts. This is the full print run of the 4th edition of Beilstein's handbook, and these are two 5-year indexes to chemical abstracts from the 50s and the 1980s. And again, this is just the index to 5 years worth of chemical abstracts, not the abstracts themselves. So, research involving more than a giraffe's worth of index volumes does not fit our usual way of thinking about the history of 20th century science. That is a reductionist march in which physics progressively conquered chemistry and biology. But like natural historians and philologists and astronomers and bureaucrats, organic chemists carry out their making and knowing in large part by means of collecting, compiling, reading, and naming. This is even true, maybe even especially true, in fields of cutting-edge high-tech research. Chemicals like PFOA and the fluorocarbons, products of Manhattan Project research. Now, this work of molecule-by-molecule compilation of data and literature references was begun in the 19th century by individual editors like Friedrich Beilstein. Before Beilstein, nobody even knew how many organic chemicals had ever been found or made. Turned out, as of the 1880s, to be about 20,000. The current number is on the order of 150 million. By 1900, however, national chemical societies started taking responsibility for these massive compilation efforts, supported by industry funding. These publications were kind of seen to be a great opportunity for building national scientific communities, as well as fostering the development of national chemical industries, although they went on to be used by many different groups for many different purposes beyond this. And as part of this transformation, compiling and navigating chemical reference literature became a profession in its own right. As with other scientific specializations, chemists who found it hard to break into the lab-dominated professoriate, often for reasons of identity, found opportunities in these new information specialties. Two of the chief editors, for example, of Beilstein were Dora Stern and Bernhard Prager, both chemistry PhDs, one a woman and one a mobility-impaired Jewish man. Both Stern and Prager left Beilstein, where they'd been for several decades, during the 1930s, as one would expect, given that Beilstein was a haven for Jewish chemists. The Third Reich had devastating effects on the lives of many of Beilstein's staff. The American Chemical Society's publication, Chemical Abstracts, founded in 1907, based out of Columbus, Ohio, had similarly expansive ambitions, but had a kind of broader scope. Not just organic chemistry, but all fields of chemistry, as well as relevant research in neighboring fields. For instance, Chemical Abstracts covered research on inorganic materials whose properties related to their physical shape more than to their molecular structure, things like the fibrous mineral asbestos. In the index, asbestos showed up under its common name, nestled among all those systematic names of organic chemicals. As the editor-in-chief, E.J. Crane, explained during a nomenclature spat with the American Medical Association, we go on the theory that rules are sometimes to be overruled by circumstances. Still, the vast majority of the names in these indexes were those long, systematic names of organic chemicals. Janet Scott, an associate editor who did a master's in chemistry at the University of Chicago before rising through the ranks at Chemical Abstracts, described this work of indexing as follows. We read aloud in pairs, one checking the cards and the other the galleys. A few hours of choice bits, like C20H25N30 delta 2 hyphen paraxylene, comma 5 hyphen open parentheses 2 hyphen furol, and so on, and so on, and so on, is enough to make us real. A great deal of work has to be turned out, at times under considerable pressure. good eyes, or at least strong ones, are absolutely essential, as is the ability to sit hour after hour without much relief. Patents, a considerable portion of the chemical literature, made this job even harder. For example, PFOA's first appearance in the chemical literature came in this 1951 patent assigned to the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, or 3M Corporation. Now, this patent did not specifically address the molecular structure of PFOA. It covered a class of chemical compounds containing between 4 and 10 carbon atoms with a certain formula, a bunch of fluorine, along with various derivatives of these substances. This was an area of American patent law called Marcouche doctrine, which allowed a range of different molecular structures to be protected as one useful product based on shared properties. And what this meant for someone like Janet Scott is that she had to go through and kind of figure out what all of the different individual molecular structures that might be encompassed by this patent would be, and write out those long systematic names for each of them. And it was in this sense that the work of editors like Scott, I think, can be compared to the work of other women as computers, like the mathematicians at NASA, depicted in the book and film Hidden Figures. That is, the expert deployment of algorithms. Meanwhile, however, a technological imaginary of instant access to information was emerging in popular articles such as Vannevar Bush's As We May Think. Cost-conscious managers started to see expert work like that of Janet Scott as an expensive bottleneck. And computing entrepreneurs like Calvin Moores saw an opportunity. The shift in the social location of expertise in the area of computing from people like Janet Scott to people like Calvin Moores is broadly characteristic of computing and information science in the 20th century. And this is something that's important to keep in mind when we think about present-day efforts to foster diversity and inclusion in computing. So, this fellow, MIT grad student turned information retrieval maven, Calvin Moores, explained that as of 1947, those interested in the indexing business are many. The Patent Office, the Census Bureau, UNESCO, large libraries, big opportunity for an entrepreneur. But the biggest push at the moment is at the American Chemical Society. The Chemical Society needed a liaison between the electronics and their semantic problem. This semantic problem was the systematic ideal. The fact that access to the world's chemical information depended on those precise but well-nigh illegible chemical names. Names that were super cumbersome for humans to work with, but were potentially good grist for Moore's electronics. Researchers in the Soviet Union, in France, and in Britain saw similar opportunities in chemistry. And so all sorts of lines of computing and information science research, things like network analysis, machine translation, search, got going during this period in this specific context of organic chemistry. This was in part due to the economic and military significance of chemistry that made all of this research justifiable. But what made this research possible, conceivable in the first place, was the systematic ideal. These extraordinarily rule-bound semantics of chemical naming, which made problems of chemical information seem uniquely tractable to computing. So, all these researchers and entrepreneurs came up with different ideas, each of which was supposed to provide the solution for transplanting the systematic ideal from print onto computers. As is often the case in the history of standards, there were many different standards that were technically sufficient. 14 standards. We need a universal standard. Now we have 15 standards. And as with railroad gauges and electrotechnology and many other cases, The standard that won out was the one that had the support of a kind of socially powerful institution. In the case of chemical information, that institution was Chemical Abstracts. And the standard was the Chemical Abstract Service Registry System, or the CAS registry. In a nutshell, the CAS registry divided up the functions of a systematic name into two parts. A computer-readable data format called a connection table took care of the molecular structure part. This was kind of like the molecule's fingerprint. A short arbitrary registry number took care of the chemical identity part. This was kind of like a molecule's social security number. It was a convenient ID number that could be used in lots of different settings and make it easy to pull together data from different sources about the same substance. So, as I mentioned before, chemists, readers of chemical abstracts, users of the registry system, were not the only people interested in chemicals. In the early 20th century, researchers in the emerging disciplines of toxicology and industrial hygiene, who were interested in chemicals as hazards for consumers or in the workplace, took an interest in chemical toxicity, which they understood at that time in terms of acute symptoms and threshold values. That is, every chemical had a threshold value, exposure to more than which, the exposed person was poisoned, an acute poison, but exposure to any less than which was presumed to be safe. However, during the 1950s and early 1960s, more insidious forms of chemical toxicity gained increasing attention. Long-term low-dose hazards associated with radioactive fallout and pesticides and drugs and cigarette smoking. In her 1962 bestseller, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson wrote, "If we are going to live so intimately with these chemicals, eating and drinking them, taking them into the very marrow of our bones, we had better know something about their nature and their power." So in this period, at the height of the Cold War, within military and civil and corporate bureaucracies around the world, the royal road to knowing something was frequently an integrated computer-based information system. In the early 60s, inquiries into the challenges posed by chemical toxicity started to pop up across the US federal government. And sure enough, all these committees concluded that what was needed was an automated federal network of information, a much more coordinated and more complete computer-based file constituting a total body, it's an interesting metaphor, a total body of chemical and biological information. The core of this research network, this federal network, was to be computer-based representations of molecular structure tied to registry numbers. That is a precise description of this registry system that CAS was already developing. There's a story behind this, but the upshot was that CAS secured several $1 million in federal grants and contracts to develop the registry system and deploy it to interconnect data at the National Library of Medicine, National Cancer Institute, Atomic Energy Commission, FDA, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and other agencies. CAS soon made similar agreements with other governments, with corporations, with non-governmental organizations, with intergovernmental organizations, such that by the mid-1970s, a computer expert at the US National Institutes of Health judged that this emerging pattern of international cooperation seemed to have ensured the fact that all molecular structure files will be linked to the CAS registry number in the future. Scientists should accordingly think of data as being linked to the body of chemical information, there's that metaphor again, by the registry number, a universal identifier. In other words, chemical and toxicological data became defined as data about an object with a CAS registry number. Data that couldn't be linked to a CAS registry number wasn't part of this body. It didn't count. As this was happening, the US government was passing myriad environmental laws, controlling pollution in waterways, in the air, controlling particular products like pesticides. By the late 1960s, at the dawn of the Nixon administration, the Ash Council, a committee on government reorganization, saw this pollution control bureaucracy as a ripe target for administrative reform. It was federally sponsored irrationality. The Ash Council's proposal to bring together all these different environmental pollution control programs within a single government agency was the genesis of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And the key to this integrated approach to pollution management at the EPA was the chemical substance. By following substances, rather than focusing on emissions pathways or emitters or sites, standard setting, monitoring, and control could be done more efficiently and rationally. So chemicals made the total environment tractable to rational, efficient administration. This was an administrative imaginary in which a molecule was a molecule, and the world emerged as an aggregate of these molecular parts. The legislative analog to the kind of founding philosophy of the EPA was the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, passed in 1976. It was a law that addressed all chemical substances, regardless of how they were used, where they were emitted, and it was centered on the formation of a chemical list, the TSCA Chemical Substances Inventory. This was the foundation, as an EPA staffer put it, on which all toxic substances control would be based. However, as I mentioned before, not all chemicals had registry numbers, because not all substances that one might wish to regulate as environmental hazards had the kind of molecular structure that earned them a place in that CAS registry. A good example, cited at the time, was asbestos, precisely the kind of stuff that this law was passed to enable the EPA to get a handle on, to regulate, and yet something that could not, by virtue of its nature as a chemical substance, actually show up within this database that was the clearinghouse for what got to count as a chemical that could be regulated. The EPA and Chemical Abstract Service came up with some workarounds around this problem, but they took huge amounts of time and resources, as the staffer in charge of the rollout of TSCA put it. In fact, it was only 4 years later, in 1980, that the EPA was able to move on from this stage of list making to actually enforcing TSCA. Right around the time that Reagan administration appointee Ann Gorsuch took charge at the EPA, and the resources available to enforce this law radically shrank. So this was the opportunity cost when toxic substances control got to be just a bureaucratic exercise. So to sum up, at the turn of the 20th century, chemists devised the systematic ideal, this idea of molecular structure as a proxy for chemical identity, in order to organize reference literature and support the growth of the chemical industry. In the mid-20th century, the systematic ideal got built into the structure of the CAS registry, this authoritative computer database of chemical substances. Concurrently, the US federal government determined that the key to addressing toxic hazards was a computer-based network of toxicological information held together by these registry numbers. And the architects of the US EPA and TSCA conceived a substance-by-substance chemical holism as a way to accommodate the material environment to rational administration. The result was a complex of law, administrative procedure, and information technology in which a claim about toxicity had by default to be a claim about a molecule. I call this molecular bureaucracy. It's the governmentality of the synthetic world, the ensemble of institutions that articulate chemicals as a population and exercise power over them. It's been powerfully enabling of certain kinds of regulation. It's given anti-fracking activists the opportunity to parasite the CAS registry, in their words, to figure out the composition and hazards of fracking chemicals. It's allowed the United Nations to take this registry number for PFOA, 3356771, and use it to link together concerns about chemicals used in Teflon making and stain-proof carpets and firefighting foams, cutting through a diversity of different trade names and identifiers. But molecular bureaucracy also constrains regulatory politics. It engenders a persistent pattern in which chemicals of concern get replaced by substitutes that turn out to be just as hazardous. This is sometimes called chemical whack-a-mole, right? Chlorofluorocarbons, ozone depleters, get phased out, they're replaced by hydrofluorocarbons, potent greenhouse gases. We know other examples of this. And this is the concern when it comes to these fluorocarbons. Thousands of different substances wait in the wings to replace PFOA, and then to replace the PFOA replacements. Whack, whack, whack. Now, there are diverse material, cultural, political, and scientific dynamics involved in producing unequal landscapes of environmental health. And I am not arguing that all of this somehow boils down to choices about databases. But molecular bureaucracy plays a broader role than you might think. The pattern of well-intentioned but stigmatizing advocacy that reduces people and lands to chemical by chemical summations of harmful exposures, the kind of thing Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck has labeled damage-centered research, this shows the marks of molecular bureaucracy. And the tendency of environmental politics to get bogged down in questions of whether a specific case of illness can be pinned to a specific molecule, or whether a specific molecule can be convincingly shown to be safe. This constant return to questions that seem to be nearly impossible to answer, given the complexity of our chemical surround. This too is molecular bureaucracy at work. To wrap up, this history of molecules in books and computers that I'm telling in my book, I see this as opening up two broad areas for research and collaboration. The first of them, which is exemplified by my account of molecular bureaucracy, follows the grain of the systematic ideal, asking what different ways of regulating and environmental politics and modes of making and thinking this twinned history of molecules and computers is brought into being. The second one works against the grain of the systematic ideal. By foregrounding the contingency and the limits of the notion that a molecule is a molecule, we can open up questions about what else chemicals and their hazards could have been, or might yet be, or maybe always have been for those paying attention. This is a project of remapping environmental toxicity that I'm pursuing right now in a collaboration with a range of colleagues in different fields, in which we're looking beyond the molecule to cultures and infrastructures of extraction, production, distribution, use, and disposal of chemical products. And I think of this work as making good on a suggestion of a chemist from back in those tropical jungle days, Charles Girard. Instead of hypothesizing about molecular structure, Girard wrote, I define substances by their metamorphoses, that is, by their past and by their future. Thank you.
What I should have said in the introduction, what I did, was what a perfect topic to have presented on Earth Day. And that's how we planned it. So I've got a lot of questions, but I'll reserve.
I'm curious, if you gave this talk not here to historians and international studies people, but over there to the chemistry department, what would you anticipate the response to be, the types of questions asked, the critiques that they offer?
I'm actually doing this on Thursday, so
Over there?
Not over there, but to a little bit more of a friendly audience. It's a group of nanotechnology, health and safety regulation experts assembled through the NIH. So I would expect them to push back and say, but come on, a molecule is a molecule. Like, we know that. That is the foundation of science. We've exhaustively proven that it does not matter where a chemical came from. What matters is its structure and the way in which its atomic molecular structure, in connection with the media in which it's placed, bring about certain properties. You make it toxic or not toxic, or persist in the body or environment or not. And what I would say to them is, but you mentioned that it matters what medium it's in. Right? You've already gone beyond this idea that there's this abstract molecule that has properties that inhere in it entirely apart from the environment in which it's placed. Of course, chemists know this, and they think about this all the time, and they don't think of the substances they work on as these caricatured doodles. They think of them as vibrating, three-dimensional assemblages that have properties that are very, very much related to the media in which they're placed. And so I would try to get them to think about the disconnect between how they actually think about the substances that they work with and the way in which those substances are represented within chemical databases. And this would give us all a chance to pile on some of the data scientists who are working with large collections of data as if that is an adequate representation of these substances. But I would hope would provide a way into talking to chemists, and this is what my goal for this talk on Thursday, about the various different ways in which we might think about what the chemicals they work with are, and the ways in which, for example, some of the properties they would think to be significant, like concentration of a chemical in a certain solution or sample, might be just as effectively or even more effectively characterized by thinking about where that chemical came from. Was it produced in minute trace quantities by an organism in the ocean, or was it produced in a big factory in West Virginia?
Nick?
So I have two questions. One is sort of on the same lines, sort of historiographical, which I'll start with, and then the other one's a thematic question. So the first question is, like, as you talked, like, I saw things that seemed familiar to me from different literatures that I know, and then but I was also, like, but then as a whole, it seemed like a story that no one group would recognize. So I was wondering, like, if I think about the literatures that you're engaging with, like history of chemistry, history of computing, like history of the book in terms of thinking about the materiality of how the information is getting out. Which group do you think would be most surprised, or which one would most be like, what's going on here? Because some things I was like, oh yeah, but then other things I could imagine some groups would be like, this seems like a very surprising story. And then the second question I had was, you kind of touched on this throughout the talk with this idea of natural versus synthetic. And so I was just wondering, can you talk a little bit about how your actors think about the distinction between natural and synthetic as you move through this period? Because you're talking sometimes about substances that they're trying to identify that they find in the environment is natural, but then the whole thing is always called synthetic chemistry. And I was especially struck, you can go back to the parallel you made at the very beginning if you feel like, but when you talked at the very beginning, you made the parallel with that jungle quote, which seemed to be a discussion about a disciplinary debate. And then you made the parallel with us today, sort of trying to navigate natural versus synthetic in our own environment, which seems to be a different sort of question. I mean, but you made the parallel that they are trying to navigate this world of chemical, but then so are we. So it seemed to touch on this natural versus synthetic. So if you could talk a little bit about what that means and how it ends up getting defined in your...
Sure. Thank you. So, first question. The audiences I've gotten the most pushback from in presenting this material are not necessarily historians of computing, but folks working in computer science, because they have a clear idea of their discipline's genealogy, and chemistry is not a part of it. And other fields are a part of it, but it's coming out of electrical engineering. So they draw connections not back to chemists managing problems of information, kind of large-scale information management, and developing solutions to that, and developing modes of representation that get taken up within applied mathematics and imported back into early computing research. But they think of all of this happening from electrical engineering, like that's their disciplinary genealogy, that's the stories they've told. And that's not a wrong story, that's not incorrect, but I think that in some important ways, this chemical genealogy of various really central projects in computer science is an important part of the story, or one of, again, going back to the kind of pluralizing these histories, it is one among several histories of computings, an important one for understanding the history of computing more broadly. Natural and synthetic are not especially important categories for the chemists and the information professionals in my story. They're significant categories, of course, in the rise of the environmental movement in the 1960s, and so it's part of my story. But nobody really cares much about what is natural and what is artificially produced. And in fact, many of the substances regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act are naturally occurring materials. There's a whole big mishmash category, like asbestos, for instance, of UVCBs, they call it, chemicals of unknown or variable composition, complex reaction products, and biologicals. Things like asbestos and spermaceti and soy flour that are regulated as potentially hazardous chemicals under this law. The place in which I am interested in pushing on this natural versus synthetic category is in thinking more broadly about what it means for a chemical substance to be anthropogenically produced. So for example, one of the first carcinogenic chemicals discovered was aflatoxin. It's produced by a mold, not produced in a laboratory, not a byproduct of industrial chemistry, but it is a byproduct of an industrial process, because aflatoxin is produced in contexts in which a whole lot of certain kinds of industrially produced foods, like peanuts or maize, are stored for long periods of time and shipped under certain conditions. And so, even though it's produced by a mold, it is absolutely a product of human industrial activity, and we ought to think about it as such. So that's, I think, where we can get to by not just setting aside this natural versus synthetic binary entirely, but trying to rework it in useful ways. Finally, the jungle issue. I think the best analogy between the confusion of the 1830s and the confusion of the 2010s is in the sense that, gosh, there are so many of these different things out there. I mean, it was like on the order of hundreds of different substances in the 1830s, not hundreds of millions. But in the present day, a really common trope in chemicals, environmental chemicals advocacy and activism is the X tens of thousands of unregulated chemicals, right? There are 80,000 unregulated chemicals in commerce in America. There are 100,000 untested chemicals in circulation in European commerce, notwithstanding certain testing requirements under the REACH law passed over there in 2007. And it is the sense that there are all of these things out there that we kind of have to come to grips with, or maybe we can try to ignore, but if we're being responsible, we're going to try to reckon with and try to get our heads around, but there are just too many of them that I think is shared between the disciplinary community of chemists in the early 19th century and broader publics in the 21st.
So I'm going to jump in with a question, which is, my family has like a drinking game when you wonder how long it'll take me to mention Mark Twain, George Orwell, or World's Fairs.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, World's Fairs are the ones that I thought about, with the picture of the chemists getting together in 1892, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
This is a period of these congresses of different sorts, including the World's Fairs, in which you have these halls of technology, which are about kind of pulling common themes together in science, and then the halls of the different nations, which are about the diversity of the world than it should be. And sort of reveling in that, but also setting up hierarchies. About 1 year after the chemists all get together, there's the World Parliament of Religions. And the idea there isn't to fuse them into one religion, but to make each of the variable religions kind of recognizable and sort of tame in some ways, this enormous variation there. So one is more kind of, I don't know, optimistic or something. I'm just wondering where you would go with this, how the gathering of chemists fits in with some of the other kinds of gatherings of people to regularize, classify at the time. And one of the other things that I don't know if it was called chemical then, I was trying to Google to figure it out, but the Hague Conference on War, which we now think about as banning chemical weapons, but I think maybe they just called them poison, but they might have called, but was chemistry, was there a kind of chemistry as salvation or chemicals, or was there already a recognition there that something very dangerous was also being unleashed in the way that we think? And that rises and falls during the rest of the time. And, you have Better Living Through Chemistry by DuPont, and you can't imagine people really saying that now. We have a kind of suspicion of it. But at that moment, was this a kind of optimistic utopian moment? Once we get all this classified, then all sorts of good things will flow, or fear? So, however you want to wrap it up.
Look at some of the rhetoric around the Obama administration's National Nanotechnology Initiative and the Materials Genome Project, if you're interested in the 21st century analog of Better Living Through Chemistry, because it's still, that imaginary is still very much alive, I think, although in different terms, crucially not involving the word chemistry, which, as you point out, has gained really a lot of very negative valences over the course of the 20th century. The 1892 Congress actually came directly out of the 1889 Universal Exposition in Paris. Friedel organized a nomenclature confab there, and that kind of mostly as a way of nucleating this broader gathering that was going to be more of an elite gathering of leading chemists in Geneva in 1892. And that kind of broad gathering with an emphasis on technological development and diversity within universal expositions and World's Fairs, and this elite chemists gathering to come together and rationally guide the future of their discipline is something that continues to play out over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So there are these gatherings that happen, often co-located with World's Fairs, called Congresses of Applied Chemistry. And there's standardization that happens there, but it's standardization of things like how we're going to measure the purity of sugar, or what kinds of instruments we're going to use to test the safety of water supplies. And these are often questions that are really clearly politically fraught. They involve interests of importing and exporting national communities. They involve specific economic interests of specific people and involved in specific industries. And the kind of chemists who were at the Geneva Congress consider these just messy, confusing, kind of dirty and economic gatherings that they would rather avoid. And so nomenclature specifically becomes a site in the early 20th century with the foundation of the International Association of Chemical Societies that kind of goes kaput in 1914 with the war, but is resuscitated in certain ways in 1919 with the foundation of a new international union. These organizations that are small and elite and transnational and cosmopolitan that are focused on addressing issues of nomenclature and thereby providing a forum for chemists from different countries to come together and kind of reproduce a form of elite sociability and guide their field becomes a kind of alternative to the more pluralist World's Fairs that are happening at the same time.
Rachel,
Thanks a lot. I guess I have a question that's just out of my own curiosity and the ways that I was listening to you about kind of what your theoretical apparatus is, just to kind of, I'm listening and I'm trying to guess and I'll just ask. Right?
Yeah.
And so I can kind of hear Foucault and this kind of governmentality. I can kind of hear, but part of kind of the problem of Foucault or discourse analysis is the way that Foucauldian analysis sometimes allies culpability or allies like the specific actors, right? To be a Marxist on Foucault, right? Allies who did what to whom, right? And so I'm actually, and you specifically cited Eve Tuck, and Eve Tuck, I think, at least my reading of Eve Tuck has been there's some knowledge is sacred, right? Some knowledge is not for research, it is not for the taking. So I guess I'm kind of trying to like, how do you, I mean, in the way kind of, the way that kind of David asked, if you go across the Aldrich Park and give this talk to chemists, right? But also if you gave this talk to culture and theory or critical theory, how would you expose your theoretical apparatus? I mean, you gave this talk, but how would you expose that to us? Like, why these questions at this time, and how do they connect to these questions that we're asking theoretically in other, like in the humanities, right? I mean, what's the Foucauldian part of what you're asking, but what's also the Eve Tuck, which is, hands off. Indigenous knowledge is for indigenous peoples, and that is not for you.
Yeah. So I am interested in how something that is pretty similar to what we might call discourses, kind of conceptual frames, things that are kind of diverse and articulated in many different ways, specifically get instantiated within particular technological systems. And by virtue of the path dependency and kind of concrete, enduring shape of things like the CAS registry database, take what is a certain set of ideas conceived for particular purposes at a particular moment in time, and just kind of get stuck. Not stuck like nobody can think outside of this framework, but for practical purposes and for legal purposes, and for purposes of claim making in a really interdisciplinary and complex regime such as environmental toxicology. Stuck. So that's, I think, like taking Foucauldian kind of analysis, but locating that sort of analysis within specific concrete informations, technologies, and laws and bureaucracies with their own histories is the sort of approach I would take. The Eve Tuck part and more broadly, that kind of payoff, I think, of doing this kind of history is finding ways to see where the languages and frameworks of scientific and political claim making that get used to ask and answer certain questions, such as questions about the consequences of exposures to toxic chemicals in the environment, might afford more or less of an opportunity for the politics of knowledge to be exercised in ways that are exclusionary. And I think Eve Tuck's work on damage-centered research is, and this I'm drawing not just from her, but from the work of Michelle Murphy and many others, on trying to rethink how one can conceive of what chemical exposures mean in a world in which we're all constantly being exposed to all sorts of different things. So why is it that certain kinds of communities are especially subject to surveillance and marginalization by virtue of having been exposed to too much of the bad stuff? So that's the approach I would take, and I think I have not in my research participated in efforts to articulate alternative politics, and I'm looking forward to, I want to do more of that, but first and foremost, what I think I can contribute from telling this history is opening up more space for those who are engaged in developing such politics of refusal, politics that attend to different sorts of substances that are attending, for example, to infrastructure, pipeline building, rather than particular molecular substances, say, to have a way of pushing back against people who say, but come on, a molecule's just a molecule.
Davida and then Joan.
Yeah, I have a couple questions about the politics of knowledge, if I can get them both in. But the first one is very general, but it wants to get at some of the issues sort of pushing at the edges of your own story. I'm glad you just mentioned Michelle Murphy. I thought of her. Jennifer Light, you referenced her when you said computers were women. So at the edges of the story is a feminist story. Women appeared and then disappeared in your story. So I want to know more first about, the very common complaint about feminists in the history of science is that they have these methodological and political observations that can get absorbed into the mainstream and they would argue devoid of the political content. So we have a story which is gendered, but a story which then becomes apparently about a molecule, about the fact of the thing, and you've helped us take that apart. The other thing which for me, as a colonial historian of 19th century science, was so obvious, your opening quote about the jungle. In 1835, the jungle metaphor is a racial metaphor. And specifically between the 1830s and the 1890s, that the jungle gets transformed to what we call the forest, specifically because of German scientific foresters in the 1880s. So that story of the racialization and the deracialization of the forest is bracketing your own story, because you referred to it in the last slide too. And of course, the story of the 19th century, why does quinine get gathered from the Andes, taken to Kew Gardens, and then taken to Asia? This is a colonial economic botany story. So you've got a colonial story pushing into your narrative here, and I'm wondering, perhaps not as part of this book, but how would you teach the colonial history, the racial history, the gendered history with these histories of the molecule? That's my first question. If I have time,
we'll come back to you.
I'll hold the second one.
There's even much farther we could go from in the way in which colonialist imaginaries and the development of the synthetic chemicals industry and the pharmaceuticals industry are tied together in the late 19th century. There's a blockbuster dye that comes out in the year of the Berlin Conference in 1882 called Congo Red. And then that dye becomes the base for the chemist and immunologist Paul Ehrlich's early chemotherapy experiments to develop a sleeping sickness drug, this drug for trypanosomiasis, that then gets tested on colonial populations in Central Africa, and without consent in highly coercive circumstances. So it's a colonial story through and through. The way that when I teach, try to maintain that frame is by not letting cinchona, Peruvian bark, fade into quinine. And there is no historical point at which this stuff just becomes the molecule. It is always the material substance, and it always carries its history with it. And how do we keep that history and the processes by which the cinchona is transplanted from South America, brought to Kew, and transplanted around the world into colonial sites. How do we keep that on stage? I'm trying to do so as best I can, and I think that in juxtaposing the itineraries of different materials, material chemicals, quinine, but also indigo, but also DDT, and so forth, I think that you can get those sort of different colonial histories and neocolonial histories as well, alongside each other in ways that their chronologies don't quite line up, but when they fail to line up, they do so in ways that I think that can kind of bring the broader expanse of those stories, help keep them on stage.
Should I wait for that question?
Yeah, Joan? Yeah.
And just a really quick comment, which is I found the science history to be really fascinating, but I was just struck by how much of what you were saying was really a wonderful case study of policy history and the kind of path dependency and organizational development that took place over the course of the century. So, I'm interested to what extent that whole literature is not just part of what you're doing, but part of what might come out of this, because it says a lot about how we address problems of the environment today.
I'm definitely interested in I use that literature and I speak to it. Some of that, insofar as I'm looking at the kind of U.S. regulatory history literature on American political development Brian Ballow's work, the associational state, the role of non-state institutions in constituting a lot of the apparatus of
Right, I mean,
statecraft.
your talk reminded me of Brian Ballow's,
Yeah.
book on that, so it has real applicability in that.
I think so, and I think that like reminding people that a lot of the shortcomings of technocracy that are really apparent in cases in which technocratic methods are applied to control of populations and to things that just seem clearly not to be susceptible to effective deployment of technocracy, like also hold in more technical settings, like the technical is also not all that effectively addressed through technocracy in many cases as well.
You want to ask your second
Okay,
question?
nobody else has. So my second one is 19th century British trivia. I would argue, well, I'll get to my argument, but here's the question. So between the 1830s and the 1890s, I wonder what you think of the Red chemist Carl Schorlemmer, who was a friend of Engels. My suspicion here is that another untold story is that the history of dialectical materialism is a history of chemistry, and that's told in Engels' friendship with the Red chemist, in which he's obsessed with the kind of development of the story of matter and motion and the kind of transition from one thing to another. So I wonder...
I don't know that much about Schorlemmer, but I really want to find out more, because it seems like a lot of people were just sort of really into Schorlemmer.
Yeah.
And there must have been something about his personality or just circumstances or something that made him an attractive figure, because some of the mathematicians whose early work adapting chemical ideas to mathematical contexts are also in conversation with Schorlemmer and referring to Schorlemmer as their sort of inspiration. I didn't know about the Engels story, though. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I would
And
just love
Marx
to know
is
about that.
writing to him. He constantly says to Engels, ask your chemist friend about this, because Marx is working on chemistry at the time. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and he's invited to the Royal Society, I think 1871 or 72, and so he's not a marginal chemist.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And another one of these sort of
Yeah.
British-German connections
Yeah.
as well. Just to go back to your previous point about the feminist story and the kind of the way in which feminist theory informs, but is maybe certain, like its politics is sometimes elided in its use in history, science, and technology and STS work. It's something I really think about, and one of the things I'm trying to do in this story is maintain, and this came through a little bit in this talk, but it's a central thread. I really want it to be a central thread of my book. Is that this is a social history, and it's a social history of a specific professional specialty in chemical information, which was absolutely an important area. I mean, this is like central in Margaret Rossiter's work on the history of women in American science. Was a really, really important chemical librarianship, chemical information, really important site for women in which women found opportunities, really made opportunities in American science, also true in Europe, in the late 19th through the mid-20th centuries. And it is a site that there's a kind of interesting difference between the history of information in chemistry and other fields of information informatics computing, in which the kind of computer boys coming in and taking over everything, the algorithm jockeys, doesn't quite happen in the same way, or at least not as quickly within this field of chemistry. And I think that part of that has to do with technical and patent, like a host of issues related to the chemical industry. But I think part of it's a social historical story of solidarities and a kind of professional sociability that was able to kind of hold its own practices and ideas about membership and core values, kind of hold the line more so than some of the other fields of librarianship, information management that got kind of colonized by computing as we understand it a little bit more quickly in the 20th century.
All right, thanks a lot. Please.